Welcome to the Deep Dive, listeners. Today we are really taking on a huge topic, American foreign policy. And specifically, we're diving deep, no pun intended, into a book called The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy. Weak Power, Great Power, Superpower, Hyperpower by Michael Mandelbaum.
Yeah, it's really something. This book takes us on this journey, starting with the United States as like a brand new nation, trying to just figure things out. And then it takes us all the way to becoming the superpower that it is today. And the book kind of breaks down this whole evolution, centuries of history into four distinct ages.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Mandelbaum gives us this roadmap, this framework to help us understand not just what happened in American foreign policy, but why it matters today. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of those four ages, let's give our listeners a little background on Michael Mandelbaum himself. Who is this guy?
Well, Mandelbaum is kind of a big deal in the world of foreign policy. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he's written a ton on American foreign policy and international relations. So he knows what he's talking about.
Okay, that's good to know. So let's dive into this history. Age 1, which Mandelbaum calls weak power, covers the period from 1765 to 1865. Now, this is when the United States was just starting out, right? Just a fledgling nation trying to find its place in a world dominated by these powerful European empires.
Yeah, think about it. You've just won a revolution against Great Britain, which at the time was like the biggest military power around. And you're
Hmm.
surrounded by all these other empires who are, kind of competing for control. And, the United States, they're just trying to survive, just to figure out how to exist, let alone thrive.
It must have been a pretty vulnerable time for the young nation, but also a time where they had to be really resourceful, right?
Yeah.
Mandelbaum actually points out that the sheer size of North America, the geography itself, played to America's advantage, especially during the Revolution.
Oh, absolutely. The British were trying to control these vast colonies, but it was just a logistical nightmare for them. The colonies were huge, with all these dense forests, uncharted territories, and, the weather could be unpredictable. All of that really favored the colonists who were fighting on their own turf. They knew the land.
It's like the British were playing an away game on a field they'd never seen before, and the colonists had home field advantage. But geography wasn't the only thing, right? Mandelbaum also talks about how important foreign alliances were during this time, especially the alliance with France.
The French were key, no question. Their military and financial support was really what helped tip the balance in favor of the colonists during the Revolution. It was a turning point.
Wow, so it's like these early decisions about who to ally with and how to use geography to their advantage were really shaping the future of American foreign policy. Mandelbaum also says that this era, this weak power age, was full of these internal debates within the U.S. about what direction the country should even go in.
Oh, yeah. Big time. These weren't just debates about specific policies. It was about these fundamental visions of what America's role in the world should be. Like, should they even be involved in the world? What should their relationship be with Europe? And, think about guys like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. I mean, they had completely different ideas about foreign policy, and those differences, those contrasting views, those still resonate with us today.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like we can see the roots, like the DNA of American foreign policy being formed right there in those early debates. On one hand, you have Jefferson, who was advocating for this more restrained approach. He was all about westward expansion, and he wanted to avoid getting entangled in these European conflicts.
And then you have Hamilton, who's, he's pushing for a much more assertive America, a country that's engaged in international affairs. He wants a strong national government, a big military, and he sees America as playing a leading role on the global stage.
It's amazing how those early ideological battles are still shaping how we think about foreign policy even today. It's not just about survival during this period. It's also about opportunity. Like Mandelbaum uses the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 as a prime example of that.
The Louisiana Purchase was, well, it was a huge deal. Napoleon was busy with all those wars in Europe, so he was willing to sell this massive territory to the United States for a ridiculously cheap price. And it totally changed the game for the U.S., doubled the size of the country, and gave them control of the Mississippi River, which was super important for trade.
So it was a bold move by Jefferson, but not everyone was thrilled about it, right? I mean, some people thought that he had overstepped his authority, that he didn't really have the power to make such a huge land purchase, and of course it had a major impact on the Native Americans who were already living on those lands.
Definitely. It's a classic example of how, American expansion, westward expansion, it's often talked about as this kind of like triumph of manifest destiny, but it came at a huge cost to Native American populations. And Mandelbaum is really good at, he doesn't shy away from that. He acknowledges that there's this darker side to American expansion, with the displacement and dispossession of Native Americans.
Right. It's important to remember that history is complicated, and it's rarely this simple story of heroes and villains. Mandelbaum's book is really good at reminding us that even events that seem positive, like the Louisiana Purchase, can have all these unintended consequences, consequences that are both good and bad.
Yeah, definitely. And those consequences, sometimes they played out in ways that were good for the U.S. and sometimes they weren't. Like, take the War of 1812. It's often seen as this kind of second war for independence against Britain, but it was a real gamble for the young nation.
I mean, the U.S. was still trying to figure out its place on the world stage.
Yeah.
Taking on the British Empire, again, that was a risky move. What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, they really wanted to assert their neutral rights on the seas. They were tired of British interference with their shipping, and they also wanted to make sure that their borders were secure to prevent further British encroachment.
Okay, so it was about protecting their interests, their sovereignty.
Exactly. And, the War of 1812 ended up being a really important moment for American identity, even though they suffered some pretty serious setbacks, and face a lot of opposition back home. But they came out of that war with a much stronger sense of national unity. And I think a growing belief that they were destined to become a major player in the world.
Plus, we got the Star-Spangled Banner out of it.
Hmm.
It was inspired by the bombardment of Fort McHenry during the Battle of Baltimore. It's crazy to think that this song, which is now such a powerful symbol of America, came out of such a dangerous and uncertain time.
Right. These events that are often full of danger and uncertainty, they can actually really bring people together, forge a sense of national purpose and identity. And speaking of asserting American interests, another key development during this weak power era is the Monroe Doctrine, which was declared in 1823.
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine. Wasn't that basically America saying, hands off the Americas to Europe?
Yeah, pretty much. It was this bold statement declaring that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization. It was a sign that the U.S. was getting more ambitious, that they were serious about becoming the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere.
So they're still pretty weak militarily at this point,
Hmm.
but they're using diplomacy and these bold pronouncements to kind of establish their sphere of influence and keep potential rivals out.
Right. It's like a preemptive strike saying stay away before the European powers could even think about expanding their empires into the Americas. And the Monroe Doctrine ended up having a huge impact on American foreign policy, setting a precedent for U.S. intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Which, is a whole other can of worms. But it's interesting that the Monroe Doctrine wasn't just about protecting American interests. It was also, I guess, about promoting this vision for the Western Hemisphere, right? Like an idea of a hemisphere based on republicanism and self-government and free from European meddling.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to create this kind of like new world in the Americas, a world that was free from the old conflicts and power struggles of Europe. But that vision, as idealistic as it was, often clashed with the reality on the ground.
That makes sense. So how does that clash play out?
Well, even as the U.S. was talking about these high-minded ideals, republicanism and all that, they were also expanding westward, pushing Native American tribes off their land, often through military force. A good example of this tension between ideals and actions is the Mexican-American War, which happened from 1846 to 1848.
Yeah, that's right. Driven by this idea of manifest destiny, the belief that they were destined to expand across the continent, the U.S. went to war with Mexico. And they won, of course. And as a result, they gained a huge amount of territory: California, Arizona, New Mexico. But that expansion came at a pretty steep price, didn't it? I mean, lots of lives were lost on both sides. Plus, it really intensified the debate over slavery, which was already a major issue dividing the nation.
Yeah, no doubt. The Mexican-American War was a military victory for the U.S., but it also revealed these deep divisions within American society, and getting all that new territory, especially territory where slavery was a hot-button issue, just made those divisions even worse. It was a major factor leading up to the Civil War.
And the Civil War, as Mandelbaum writes, was this pivotal moment in American history. It wasn't just a turning point for domestic politics, but for foreign policy as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Civil War was this huge test for the U.S., a test of whether the country could even survive. And when the Union won and slavery was abolished, that marked a profound transformation. The U.S. came out of that war stronger and more unified, and it paved the way for the country to become a true great power. It really did. The Civil War, Mandelbaum calls it a crucible, and he's right. The U.S. came out of that war stronger, more unified, ready to play a bigger role in the world. Which brings us to age two, great power, from 1865 to 1945.
This is where we see America transforming,
Right.
right? Going from this largely agrarian society to this industrial powerhouse. It's the era of railroads, steel mills, factories, and of course, westward expansion continues. All of that contributes to America's growing power and influence globally.
Yeah, think about those classic images, the railroads spanning the continent, these massive factories pumping out steel and all sorts of manufactured goods, cities exploding with growth, all these immigrants coming in looking for a better life. The U.S. was becoming a force to be reckoned with economically and, militarily too.
And that power, that newfound power, it starts to project outward, right? The U.S. starts to look beyond its borders for new markets, new opportunities. Mandelbaum argues that this was partly fueled by the closing of the American frontier, that sense that there wasn't any more land to conquer within the continental U.S.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. All that energy, all that ambition that had been focused on westward expansion, it needed somewhere to go, and that somewhere became overseas expansion, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region.
But that expansion wasn't always peaceful, was it? I mean, the Spanish-American War in 1898 is a perfect example of that. What started with the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor ended up being a major turning point in U.S. foreign
Oh,
policy.
yeah. The Spanish-American War, it was a short war, but the consequences, those were huge. The U.S. ended up with new territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and it really solidified this idea of the U.S. as a global power, a power with interests all over the world.
The Philippines especially, that was a big deal, right? It was the first time the U.S. acquired a major colony outside of North America.
Right.
I mean, it's a pretty clear signal that their foreign policy is becoming more imperialistic.
Totally. This is the age of European empires. They're busy carving up Africa and Asia, creating these vast colonial empires. And the U.S., with all this newfound power, it looks like they're trying to get in on the action. Mandelbaum points out that this era also sees the rise of what he calls big stick diplomacy, a term that's often associated with President Teddy Roosevelt.
Big stick diplomacy. Doesn't sound very subtle. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means using military power to get what you want in foreign policy. The idea is that if you project strength, if you show that you're willing to use force, then other countries will be less likely to mess with you, less likely to challenge your interests.
So it's not just about having a big military. It's about showing that you're willing to use it.
Exactly, it's about deterrence. And Roosevelt, he was famous for saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." The big stick, that was American military might. And Roosevelt believed that if the U.S. used that stick wisely, then they could really shape events to their advantage.
But Roosevelt, I mean, wasn't he also a big believer in diplomacy and international cooperation? I mean, didn't he win the Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, he did. Roosevelt wasn't just a warmonger. He definitely believed in diplomacy and negotiation. But he also knew that diplomacy, it only works if you've got something to back it up with.
So it's about striking a balance, right? Being able to negotiate from a position of strength.
Exactly. And that approach, that big stick diplomacy, it had a big impact on U.S. foreign policy in the early 20th century. Roosevelt intervened in Latin America a lot, asserting U.S. dominance in the region. And like you said, he helped negotiate the peace treaty that ended the Russo-Japanese War.
So he was a complex figure, right? Kind of a peacemaker and a warrior at the same time. Mandelbaum also talks about Woodrow Wilson, who led the U.S. into World War I in 1917. Now, that was a pretty big shift, wasn't it? Moving away from that more isolationist tradition that had characterized earlier eras.
Absolutely. World War I was a huge turning point. It's the first time the U.S. gets involved in a major European conflict. And it really marks the beginning of a much more interventionist foreign policy for the U.S.
What made Wilson decide to get involved? I mean, the U.S. had always tried to stay out of European wars.
Well, a few things happened. First, there was the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger liner that was carrying American citizens. A German U-boat sunk it, and that really outraged the American public. And then there were concerns about German aggression, the threat that it posed to American security and economic interests.
But it wasn't just about protecting American interests, was it? Wilson also talked about this moral obligation to defend democracy and freedom.
You're right. Wilson was very idealistic. He famously said that the U.S. was entering the war to make the world safe for democracy. He really believed that if America got involved, that they could help create a lasting peace, and build a new world order based on international cooperation and collective security.
That was his 14 points plan, right?
Hmm.
And the League of Nations. Very ambitious, very idealistic. He wanted to create a world where countries would settle their differences through diplomacy and negotiation, not war.
Yeah, exactly. He was trying to break away from that old way of doing things, the way that had always led to war. But Wilson's vision, it faced some major challenges.
Like the fact that the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, which included the League of Nations.
Right. The Senate was really divided, and they were really wary of getting entangled in European affairs. So they voted against the treaty, and the U.S. never joined the League of Nations.
That's pretty ironic, isn't it? The U.S. played this huge role in winning World War I, and then they decided to pull back from the peacemaking process, from the very organization that their president had championed.
Yeah. And that decision had some pretty serious consequences. Without the U.S., the League of Nations was weak, and it wasn't able to prevent the rise of fascism or the outbreak of World War II.
It's like a missed opportunity, a chance to create a better world that just slipped away. And then World War II comes along. Now, this conflict, even more than World War I, is going to transform the U.S. into a global superpower.
No question, World War II was a global catastrophe. It pushed humanity to its limits and completely changed the balance of power in the world. And the U.S., they were hesitant to get involved at first, but then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and that changed everything.
Pearl Harbor. That was a shock to the entire nation, a real wake-up call, and it completely galvanized the American people. They went into that war with incredible ferocity and determination.
Yeah, and they play a crucial role in the Allied victory. In Europe and in the Pacific, their industrial might, their military power, and just this absolute commitment to defeating fascism, it was all essential in turning the tide of the war.
And when the war ended, Europe was in ruins, totally exhausted. But the U.S., they came out of the war relatively unscathed, their economy booming, they were the leading industrial power in the world, their military was unmatched, and they had influence all over the globe.
The U.S. was a superpower. The only other country that came close was the Soviet Union.
And that rivalry, that's what's going to define the next era in U.S. foreign policy, the Cold War. And that takes us to, to a period that I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with, the Cold War. That clash of ideologies, capitalism versus communism. It's the focus of Mandelbaum's Age 3, which he calls superpower. It covers the period from 1945 to 1991. It's this era of intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, a rivalry that really shaped global politics, economics, and culture for nearly half a century.
Yeah, I mean, imagine a world literally divided into two armed camps, each with enough nuclear weapons to wipe out, all of civilization, multiple times over. That was the reality of the Cold War. And it wasn't fought on traditional battlefields, with tanks and trenches. It was this war of ideology, espionage, these proxy wars fought in places like Korea and Vietnam, and just this constant, looming threat of nuclear annihilation.
It's a period that I think still fascinates us, and terrifies us a little bit, even decades later. Mandelbaum, he does a good job of breaking down the key features of the Cold War. He talks about the nuclear arms race, the ideological competition between communism and capitalism, and all those proxy wars that were fought all over the globe.
It was this global struggle for influence, really, a battle to win over the hearts and minds of people all around the world. It played out everywhere. I mean, you saw it at the United Nations, in the newspapers and magazines, on the radio and TV, even in the music and movies that people were consuming.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Cold War really permeated everything. It was everywhere. Mandelbaum describes these early Cold War policies that the U.S. put in place to try to contain the spread of Soviet influence. Policies like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan.
Yeah, the Truman Doctrine. That was announced in 1947, and it basically pledged American support for any country that was being threatened by communism, by Soviet aggression. It was basically saying that the U.S. was going to actively resist the spread of communism, and they were going to use their military and economic might to do it.
And then there was the Marshall Plan, right?
Yeah.
Which started in 1948. That was a massive economic aid program. The goal was to rebuild Europe after World War II and to prevent the spread of communism in Western Europe.
The Marshall Plan was Well, it was really a success story. It helped to revitalize the economies of Western Europe. And, that economic recovery led to greater political stability, which made those countries less susceptible to communist influence. It really strengthened the ties between Western Europe and the United States.
It was a big investment, a sign that the U.S. was, I guess you could say, stepping up as a leader in the post-war world. And then, of course, there's the formation of NATO in 1949. That was a military alliance that brought together the United States and the countries of Western Europe. And, well, the whole point was to defend against the Soviet threat.
NATO, it was a defensive alliance. It was meant to deter Soviet aggression, but it also served as this symbol of Western solidarity, and it was a counterweight to the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet-led military alliance that formed in 1955.
So Europe is divided, the Cold War is heating up, and there are these constant tensions, these crises that really could have led to nuclear war. I mean, Mandelbaum walks us through some of those really scary moments, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War.
Yeah, the Korean War, that was the first hot war of the Cold War. It broke out in
Right.
1950, and it was a proxy war. The U.S. and its allies were supporting South Korea, and the Soviet Union and China were backing North Korea.
It was a brutal war. Millions of people died, and it ended in a stalemate. And Korea is still divided today, all these years later.
Right.
It shows you how dangerous these proxy wars could be, how easily they could escalate into a direct conflict between the superpowers.
And then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That happened in 1962. And that was, that was probably the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. The Soviets had put nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast.
It was a terrifying time. I mean, those 13 days in October 1962, that was probably the most dangerous moment in human history. The whole world was holding its breath. President Kennedy, he was under a lot of pressure to attack Cuba, but he chose to negotiate with Khrushchev, and eventually the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles.
The Cuban Missile Crisis really showed everybody how dangerous the nuclear arms race was, and it led to some important changes, like the creation of a hotline between Washington and Moscow, a direct line of communication so the leaders could talk to each other directly, to prevent these kinds of misunderstandings and miscalculations.
But then, of course, you had the Vietnam War, which escalated throughout the 1960s and went on for over a decade. That was another incredibly costly conflict, and it was really divisive back home in the U.S. It really tested the limits of American power and American resolve.
Yeah, the Vietnam War was a disaster, a quagmire. The U.S. military, powerful as it was, couldn't win against a determined guerrilla force. And back home, the war divided the country. There were huge anti-war protests, and people really began to question the U.S.'s role in the world, whether they should be intervening in these faraway conflicts.
Vietnam was a turning point. It led to a real reassessment of American foreign policy, a more cautious approach to military intervention. And then you have the period of détente in the 1970s. Things calmed down a bit between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They signed some arms control agreements, started talking to each other more. It was a period of, well, maybe not quite peace, but at least less tension.
Détente was it was a cautious kind of optimism, There was a sense that maybe, just maybe, the Cold War rivalry could be managed, that they could avoid nuclear war. But détente was fragile, and it didn't last.
It ended with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And then Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. And he took a much tougher stance toward the Soviet Union.
Reagan, he was a true believer in American strength. He increased military spending, started supporting anti-communist movements all over the world, and he really challenged the legitimacy of the Soviet Union.
Reagan's policies, along with, the growing economic and political problems within the Soviet Union, all of that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. A Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and then the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991. And just like that, the Cold War was over.
And the United States was the only superpower left standing. It was a huge victory for the U.S., for democracy, for capitalism, but it also created this whole new set of challenges. I mean, now the U.S. was the sole superpower. They had to figure out how to manage this new world order, this unipolar world.
And that's what Mandelbaum's final age is all about, the hyperpower age.
Yeah.
From 1991 to the present. This is the era of American dominance, unrivaled military and economic power. This is the era of globalization, of the internet, of 9/11, and the war on terror. And it's an era that's still unfolding.
Yeah, and it's an era full of contradictions, full of complexities. The U.S. had won the Cold War, but that didn't mean that the world suddenly became this peaceful, harmonious place. There were all these new threats, new challenges, new uncertainty.
Mandelbaum's book ends on a uh, I guess you could say on a cautious note. He points out that the U.S. is facing a world that's changing rapidly, with shifting power dynamics, new technologies, and evolving threats. And he suggests that the U.S. needs to adapt its foreign policy to meet these challenges. Yeah, he argues that the U.S. needs to be more adaptable, more collaborative, and more willing to work with other countries to solve global problems.
Yeah, Mandelbaum's book, The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, it's really a thought-provoking read. It makes you think about the evolution of American power, about the role the U.S. has played in the world, and about what the future might hold.
And it's generated a lot of discussion. Some people, they praise Mandelbaum for his comprehensive approach, for his clear writing style, for how he connects these historical events to the issues we're facing today. They appreciate that he provides this really broad overview of American foreign policy, showing how it's changed over time, but also how some things have stayed the same.
And then there are others who, well, they think Mandelbaum's framework is a little too simplistic. They say it doesn't really capture all the nuances and complexities of foreign policy. They know that, he focuses too much on great power politics and doesn't pay enough attention to things like domestic politics, economic interests, and the influence of culture.
But I think even the criticisms, show how valuable this book is. The fact that it generates debate, that it challenges us to think critically about American foreign policy, that's what makes it such a great starting point for further discussion.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in American history, foreign policy, international relations, any of that, I definitely recommend checking out The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy by Michael Mandelbaum. It's a book that will make you think, make you question your assumptions, and maybe even change how you see America's place in the world.